You see? All right, there we go. All right, well, good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We are joined here this afternoon by Ann Ravel, who's a former commissioner of the Federal Elections Commission of the United States, and with Chairman Thomas Hicks, who's the president of the Electoral Assistance Commission of the United States. Welcome, Ann, and welcome, Thomas.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Dr. Marcelo Peregrino from Brazil. He's president of CAOESTE. It's a pleasure to have you all here to talk a little bit about what these two federal commissions do in the United States to monitor campaigns on one hand and assist election officials on the other. As we all know, there's a general election to be held on November 8th in the United States, where people will get to elect 35 out of 100 seats in the Senate, renew all of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives, and there will also be some gubernatorial elections in quite a few states, in 36 states. So this will also mark the first election since the redistricting process ended in most states, which happens every 10 years and has been an important discussion point in the public agenda. Perhaps that's a topic for another webinar. It's a whole topic all in itself. But I will first give Ann the floor to talk briefly about the role that the FEC plays in monitoring election campaigns, right? And then Chairman Hicks can proceed with a longer presentation about what the EAC does to help election officials across the United States. And of course, after that, we will allow some time for questions. We ask everyone in attendance to please use the Q&A section of the application to submit your questions instead of the chat. If you feel comfortable, you can also raise your hand, and we can give you the mic so you can ask your question directly to either Ann or Tom. But let's get started. Ann, welcome, and thank you for joining. You have the floor.
Thank you. The Federal Election Commission was established after Watergate, when, as many people here in the United States know, there were foreign donations of money that went in bags of money to the White House of when President Nixon was president to fund the people who were going into the Democratic Party's headquarters illegally to get information. And people were concerned about the fact that there was no disclosure of campaign funding. So while it's called the Federal Election Commission, it really doesn't have anything to do with voting or voting processes per se. It mostly has to do with public disclosure of funds that are raised and spent in federal elections. So that's for president and members of Congress. And then it also is supposed to ensure the enforcement of restrictions on contributions, that is, how much can be contributed to those campaigns, and any expenditures that are being made to influence federal elections. And there is also a program in the United States that does not have a lot of use these days because the amount is kind of low, but there is a public financing system for a presidential campaign. And that is also administered by the FEC. The reason that it's not used much is that the ability of that campaign financing system for the presidential campaigns is to match the first $250 of contributions and to fund some major party candidates. But the amount of money that is actually given is so much less than what people can now get through independent expenditures from, whether they be from PACs or corporations or unions. And so there's very little that it's used in presidential campaigns since Obama, in fact. And then there are also ways of overseeing certain restrictions at the party conventions, and that it too is part of the role of the Federal Election Commission. But, and I'm so glad Tom Hicks is joining us because while we did not have overlapping roles, we both care about the integrity of the election and work together personally during the time that I was at the FEC. And while the FEC is supposed to be an independent regulatory agency that interprets, defends, and administers the law, in fact, the FEC has no more than, it has 6 members that are commissioners, including the vice chair and the chair that rotates. And they're not supposed to have more than 3, or they do not have more than 3 of one political party. And yet it requires 4 votes in order to do anything. And in the last 15 years or so, that has become a real issue because it is hard with 3-3 and so much divisiveness in the political system in the United States to get 4 votes to enforce the law. So I will turn it over to Tom, and I don't know if you want to introduce him, Eduardo.
I would love to, because I know that I believe that you are you go way back, and also I think you were both nominated by President Obama. So you share that in coincidence. So I will just, yes, of course, please go ahead.
Okay, so Tom Hicks is the elections president, as you said, and counsel at the U.S. House of Representatives at one point, involved in issues of campaign finance as well as election reform. And now he is the president of the EAC, and his focus is on things that are really important in this country now. And that includes, and he'll speak for himself as well, but voter access, cybersecurity, assuring access for overseas American voters as well. And he works with state and local election officials to improve the voting process. And the EAC itself is also, like the FEC, an independent agency that does some, has a lot of work in dealing with regulations for the Help America Vote Act. And on that note, I will also say he's great. So, and it's so good to see you again, Tom.
Thank you so much, Anne. And it's really, really awesome to see you. And it's been way too long, and I hope to see you in person relatively soon. I have a brief presentation that I can give. There are a couple of videos in here as well that detects or talks about the EAC as well, but I think of it as it's a great agency. It's also an independent agency. We deadlock on some things every once in a while as well, but 95% of the stuff that comes in front of us is not political. And so right now we're able to basically have a 4-0 vote. There's only 4 commissioners, but there's usually a 4-0 vote on things as we move forward with things. So I will look to share my screen, and then hopefully it will work. So are you seeing the presentation? All right, great. So the EAC's main goal is to improve the administration of elections and help Americans participate in the process. And how do we do that? Basically, this is a prelude to the video I'm about to show, which I call my mother's video, because I was the first in my family to graduate college and graduate law school. I worked in the Clinton administration for over, almost the entire 8 years that he was in office. I worked in the US Congress for over a decade, nominated and confirmed by the United States Senate, traveled all over the world, all four corners of the world, basically. And my parents still would ask me, what exactly do you do? And so this video, although not made for my parents, talks about what our agency actually does.
So what is the EAC? Glad you asked. EAC stands for Election Assistance Commission, and simply put, our goal is to make your job easier. No, seriously. We were established by the Help America Vote Act of 2002 as an independent, bipartisan commission charged with helping Americans vote. The primary way we do that? By ensuring election officials have the support and resources they need. We help in a few ways. We craft and adopt the voluntary voting system guidelines, accredit test laboratories, and certify voting systems, serve as the nation's clearinghouse of information and best practices related to elections. We also maintain the National Mail Voter Registration Form, which can be used to register to vote, update registration information with a new name or address, or register with a political party, and develop recommendations and standards that address the needs of voters, state and local election leaders, and other election stakeholders. At the end of the day, we work to ensure every eligible American has the opportunities to vote independently, privately, and with confidence in our nation's election system. We do everything in our power to make sure election officials have what they need to support that. Learn more at eac.gov.
So, like Ann said, our agency is a bipartisan commission. We are selected by the congressional leaders of the Congress, basically the majority leader of the House, the Speaker of the House, the minority leader, the majority leader of the Senate, and minority leader. So Ms. Pelosi sent my name to President Obama, who then decided to nominate me for this position. And we're Senate confirmed. Basically, if you know about our Supreme Court, we go through that same sort of confirmation process. Basically, the FBI comes out, interviews us, our families, make sure that there's no financial hiccups in our background, and then we are sent over to the Senate for hearings, where we sit in front of senators and answer questions, and then confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Happy to say that when I was confirmed back in 2014, it was by unanimous consent, meaning that not one senator voted against me at that point or raised that issue to hold up my nomination any longer. So what do we do as commissioners? We basically serve as resources and advisors. So travel across the country. I've been lucky enough to see all 50 states. And speak in this role that I have right now. I would say that I've gone to at least 30 states and spoken to election officials across the country and voters as well on what issues are affecting them and how we can go about making it better. I'll talk a little bit later about the ways that we do that. It's mostly through a carrot and stick approach, meaning offering money so that the states can improve the process overall. But what we also do is we brief Congress and federal officials on what's going on in the country and how we can improve the process overall. The American electoral system is very decentralized. If you look at it and you think of it as we have the 50 states and therefore the 50 states make that determination of who's going to be the next president or members of Congress and so forth. That's not actually the case of how it is. each jurisdiction, basically, and this map shows basically east of Texas, or divided Texas eastward. It shows the jurisdictions across the country and how they are situated within the states. And those jurisdictions determine basically the voting machines they use, the methods that they use, how you're eligible to vote, other than the constitutional pieces of saying that you're over 18 and a US citizen. This is part of our e-survey, and we were basically getting information back from the states and these jurisdictions. And the reasons that New York, Illinois, and Alabama are in gray is because they hadn't gotten us the information back at the time of this. But there are some states that do things uniformly. Maryland, Georgia use the same voting equipment throughout the entire state. And so you'll have issues that come up with those sorts of things as well. But overall, this says there's about 6,400 jurisdictions around the country dealing with elections. And I would say that that's probably closer to 8,000 or 9,000. So what do election officials do? Ongoing, this darker blue here shows that they deal with election law, finances, the Americans with Disabilities Act, security, technology, public relations has become a big issue since 2000, and human resources in terms of hiring election poll workers for running elections overall. In order to have that election prepared for the lighter blue with mail, street file maintenance, voter registration, and so forth, talks about the things that election officials must do in order to have the election function well. And so for election night and beyond, which is the dark red here, talking about list maintenance to ensure those who are eligible to vote are voting, and dealing with other aspects as well. So one of the things that's not on here is provisional balloting, but canvassing and voting and tabulation are other things that the election officials deal with on election night and beyond. One of the things that I also want to make a highlight of is that in the United States, in some states, even though someone may be an election official, that might not be their only job when they're running the election. So for instance, in Texas, the election official also deals with the branding licenses. So when they brand cattle at the end of the day, those election officials are doing that as well. Some jurisdictions, the election officials may be driving the school bus or dealing with marriage licenses as well. And so our next slide talks about some of the agencies that we work with in terms of the election administration piece. And gave a great overview of the Federal Elections Commission dealing with campaign behavior and campaign finance. As the video showed, we were established by the Help America Vote Act. We're also an independent federal agency. But if you had talked to me about before 2020 of what other agencies we would be dealing with in terms of federal elections issues, I would have been taken aback by the fact that we work with the Centers for Disease Control because of the ongoing pandemic. Or we've always worked with the Postal Service, but that it was magnified after the 2020 primaries. Dealing with the Census Bureau, the Department of Justice, the Federal Voting Assistance Program, which is housed in the Department of Defense, that allows for overseas and military people to be able to cast their votes. And most recently, we've dealt with the Department of Homeland Security, Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency, dealing with cybersecurity threats after the 2016 election or during the 2016 election. And so there are a multitude of government agencies that work towards elections, but the Election Assistance Commission is the only federal agency that deals with the administration of elections 24 hours a day, or that's our main task. So in terms of accessibility, as I mentioned earlier, the Help America Vote Act lays out protections for voters with for voters with disabilities, and charge the EAC with providing best practices for election officials and the voters that they serve. One thing that I want to point out is in the top right-hand corner here is our new logo, and underneath the red check mark are little dots. And those dots may look like computer dots, but they actually spell out vote in Braille. And that's because of our huge commitment to the disabled community and to ensure that they can vote independently and privately. And so now that you know what the EAC is, here are some of the ways that we also work to support accessibility. Because of HAVA, the EAC strives to incorporate the needs of voters with disabilities into everything that we do. We ensure our website and all its contents are accessible. We caption all of our videos, and we have interpreters and live captioning at in-person events. We encourage uses of the 2018, 2020, and the CARES Act funds for accessible voting machines and other election day HAVA requirements. We also issued frequently asked questions for election officials, making sure that everything they do is accessible, like absentee voting and vote by mail. As I previously mentioned, the clearinghouse function is to develop and share information and best practices to those 6,400 jurisdictions that were listed there. On accessibility issues, the EAC brings together election officials and disability advocates as part of our clearinghouse functions, and we disseminate best practices. We also have a voting rights card, which you see here, that's available in the Parkit version, which is on the left, as well as a large print and Braille version for voters with disabilities they can take into the website, take into their polling site to ensure that they know what their rights are. The EAC has also added a member to our clearinghouse team that will serve as an expert resource to inform our work products when we design them, to assist all our stakeholders, including election officials, as well as to inform accessibility related activities and policy matters within the voluntary voting system guidelines, and ultimately to address the needs of the voting community with disabilities. And I say this constantly in terms of, if you live long enough, you will have some form of disability, whether or not that's the not being able to read without your glasses because you can't see as well as you once did, or having mobility issues. As we all get older, those issues come up a little bit more so. And so, so the EAC is dedicated to establishing accessibility working groups that plans to update, maintain, and ensure that the accuracy of all our products are for those who have disabilities. In addition to providing best practices, we also hope to produce a checklist to assist election officials to ensure that the entire electoral process is accessible from voter registration through ballot verification. The EAC has already released part 1 and 2 of voter registration and in-person voting, and the EAC has also produced accessible products aimed at addressing the needs of Native Americans who have disabilities and voters with disabilities who have language access requirements. We're currently working on best practices related to drop box placement for vote by mail. In long-term project, we'll also look at practices for deployment of voting machines in the polling precincts. And we're also looking to narrow the digital divide with a report that was released on July 26, which is also the 32nd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that report is available on our website. Similar to our efforts to make sure that voting is accessible for Americans with disabilities, HAVA also seeks to ensure that voters with limited English proficiency have the opportunity to understand their ballots and cast those ballots with confidence. That's why our team of subject matter experts have worked diligently to update and create new resources about language access for voters with disabilities that they can use across the country. In the last year, the EAC has expanded the number of translations made available for voters who have language access issues. The agency's glossary of election terminology, which is nearly 1,300 terms and phrases, has been updated and translated into 21 languages. The 3 additional examples of resources for language accessibility include best practice for unwritten languages, a document for making election messaging outreach accessible that includes a helpful checklist, and a checklist that so jurisdictions can establish a language access program on their own. And this is all because we've updated the form, which is including for native languages translations. And that was the first time ever that we ever did that. So this is another video that I will show you. Under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which requires the census to update it every 5 years, that requires states and jurisdictions to make voting materials and other assistance accessible for language minority groups. The most recent update was in December of 2021. So I will play this video now.
The EAC offers many resources for language accessibility. Election officials, community organizations, and voters can find these resources online at eac.gov/language-access-resources. Here, you can find information about current language access designations, legal context about language access requirements, coverage, and implementation, EAC resources for election officials, translated materials, federal, state, and local best practices, and resources from nonprofit and academic organizations. Under the current language access designation section, you can find an interactive map to quickly and easily see which jurisdictions are covered by Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. Click on the page numbers at the bottom of the tool to see a list of state abbreviations. Select a state to see the full report for that state. If you hover over one of the dots on the map, you can see detailed information for the selected county, city, or town. Select one of the languages in the donut chart to view each of the communities in the state that provides voting materials in the selected language. You can also select a jurisdiction from the table on the right-hand side of the screen. Select the full screen icon to see a larger view of this report. Hit the escape key or click Exit Full Screen to go back to the original view of the page. By selecting All Counties or All Cities options, you can quickly see each community that is covered under Section 203 and sort these communities by language type. The EAC is proud to support election officials in serving language minority populations within their jurisdictions. If you have any questions or comments about these resources, please email us at clearinghouse@eac.org.
That has been a huge addition to our agency, and that goes towards funding. When I first started working at the EAC, our funding was just under $7 million. But as 2021 and fiscal year 22 have rolled around, we're just a little bit over $20 million, which may sound like a huge jump, but in actuality, we're not still at the same level that we were in 2010. But as I mentioned earlier, among the EAC's most important function is serving as a clearinghouse for best practices for election administration. As part of our effort to provide election officials with valuable election resources, we established this Clearinghouse Division and Department. This division includes former election officials and experts with specialized knowledge in election law, audits, American Indian, tribal voting, and as I stated earlier, one of our 8 subject matter experts focuses solely on accessibility. As you can see on our website at eac.gov, we believe we produce a lot of valuable material that I'll go over with the next slide. So a variety of new resources have been developed over the last year based on the needs of election officials and the feedback that we've received. The list of resources you see here will continue to grow, and we hope to hear more from election officials on how to improve these materials and what resources would best help them serve their voters. But I would just like to highlight just a couple of these. The EAC has established the Election Official Security webpage on eac.gov with information for election officials. This includes information from the FBI on how to report a threat, the different challenges facing election officials, defining common threats and harassment, what to document, cybersecurity best practices, and mental health resources. The EAC is trying to be proactive in responding to the pressing need, such as chain of custody best practices and information on the audit process. We've also added 6 more languages to the translated material. And most recently, we've published a new toolkit with customized materials to help election officials communicate with post-election processes. We've also produced a variety of materials on the paper supply chain issues and challenges to mitigate any sort of issues that may develop for the upcoming elections. Finally, last week, we released a poster and presentation for election officials explaining election result reporting. The EAC is also developing more resources that will be available soon and updating pieces of information that have gone stale, obviously, for a number of years. And we also have a monthly newsletter that I encourage folks to sign up for, and for the public to stay informed on what things we're doing and other resources that we have and events that will be coming up that I'll show you how to sign up for that at the end of this presentation. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we do pretty well is administer federal grants. So since 2018, Congress has authorized $880 million in HAVA Fund security grants, as well as $400 in grants dedicated to election officials to help during the pandemic. Earlier this year, Congress authorized another $75 million in election security grants. And although it arrived basically halfway through the fiscal year, it was better late than never in getting that money to the states. States are not going to turn that money down, but they can always use more. All of these are formulaic grants so that each state and territory perceives a predetermined amount based on the statutory formula. And our grants team is there to answer questions from election officials, as well as the allowable expenses and the reporting requirements. So as of last month, the states collectively reportedly spent 52% of that $805 million distributed in 2018 and 2020. And for 2023, the House recently passed a package which includes $400 million in security grants. That package is headed to the Senate for approval. And I also want to note that in looking at some of the Senate language, they also included $400 million in security grants. So it's probably pretty likely that whatever is passed out of the Congress this year will include 400 million in security grants moving forward. So, and each state uses these funds differently, depending on short-term and long-term needs. So to give you an idea of exactly what those uses are, mostly it's used towards enhancing voters on procedures, rights, and technology, training of election officials, poll workers, volunteers, and improving accessibility in the polling place for individuals with disabilities, including non-visual access for visually impaired folks. Providing self-service options for voters to get information on voter registration status, polling locations, and general information as well. And how do we deal with election security issues? It's always been a priority for the EAC, and state and local jurisdictions have a variety of safeguards that are in place. But after 2016 and 2020, we've heard a lot more about election security. So this video will give you a brief understanding of that as well. Leah,
have you ever wondered about how we secure elections? That's a fair question. Security has always been at the heart of what election officials do, which is why each state and jurisdiction has measures in place to ensure security in all phases of the election process. Most people don't see the behind-the-scenes work that makes it happen, but today we're giving you a peek. Let's start with voter registration, which is a security measure in itself. Registration ensures that all state eligibility requirements are able to vote and helps keep track of who has cast a ballot in an election. If a voter shows up on election day and believes she is eligible and registered to vote, but, for example, her name does not appear on the registration list, or she does not have the required form of ID, she can cast a provisional ballot. Election officials determine whether or not to count provisional ballots after verifying the voter's eligibility. Once you're registered, election officials take a great deal of care to keep your personal data safe. Only authorized personnel have access to the voter registration database. All database traffic is monitored and logs detail each time the database is accessed or changed. Routine backups ensure all data can be restored if any unexpected modifications are made. Though data are public record, personal information is only released in accordance with a state's legal guidelines. Now to the heart of the election process, voting. U.S. elections are conducted independently across thousands of local jurisdictions, each following unique laws and statutes, which means there's no single point of access. Transparency is built into the election process. Almost all processes and procedures require that 2 or more trained personnel be involved. And these folks have taken an oath to uphold state election laws and protect the security of the election. In addition, representatives of political parties or candidates, and sometimes even members of the general public, are allowed to observe and monitor activities throughout the election processes. If something does happen on or near election day, most jurisdictions have backup plans to make sure voters can still cast their ballots. These plans cover everything from voter registration list backups to moving of poll locations due to a natural disaster or power failure. A good deal of care is taken to ensure voting equipment is safe too. When it isn't being used, voting equipment is stored in a facility accessible only to trained election personnel. Before voting starts, each piece of voting equipment is put through logic and accuracy tests to make sure ballots will be counted correctly, and often the public is invited to observe these tests. Ballots and election equipment are typically secured with tamper-evident seals and transported to polling places in secure containers. And each time they switch hands, it has to be documented. While materials and equipment are in use, they're closely watched by election workers trained to notice and respond to any suspicious behavior. What about the folks who vote by mail? Well, these ballots are protected by state rules and procedures that determine how they must be handled. While steps are taken to ensure that mail ballots are as private as those cast inside a polling place, mailed envelopes must be signed so that the signature on the ballot envelope may be compared to the signature on the voter's registration form. Such signature requirements let election officials make sure these ballots have been filled out by the correct voter. Now to counting those results. Today, most ballots are counted electronically, either by the same voting machines where votes are cast or by devices that scan paper ballots. Most jurisdictions have adopted policies that forbid machines from connecting to the internet in accordance with state and local guidelines. When the polls close on election night, election personnel collect vote counts from each machine and report results to election headquarters. The votes are tabulated at election headquarters before they're reported to the public. Ballots and equipment are then securely transported back to election headquarters. Although we may know who won an election within a few hours, results are not official until the vote is certified by the election office. That happens once the office verifies the ballots from each precinct, early voting, absentee voting, uniformed and overseas citizen ballots, and provisional ballots. These ballots are kept in a secure location as required by law. Once all records are confirmed, the election results become official, and many jurisdictions conduct post-election audits to further validate results. So you see, there's a lot that goes into keeping our elections secure, but it's worth it. It means ensuring the voices of the American people are always heard.
So that is the last video, but I only have one more point to really talk about, and that's related to security with our voluntary voting system guidelines, or VSG, where we accredit testing labs and certified voting equipment, as the video talked about. In 2021, February of, the EAC approved the latest iteration of the voluntary voting system guidelines 2.0. And our testing and certification program provides certification, decertification, and recertification of voting systems, as well as the accreditation of voting system testing labs. While states are not required to participate in the program, some have enacted laws and have regulatory requirements on their level of participation. The purpose of the EAC's National Voluntary Voting System Certification Program is to be an independent verifying source to comply with the functions of capability, accessibility, and security requirements. We are still implementing these new guidelines, and we've adopted a life cycle policy in April of 2022. And lastly, the end-to-end program protocols will be used to establish the process overall. So overall, all this information can be found on eac.gov. And with that, I will stop for questions. But if you have questions after this and you want to contact me directly, my email is thicks@eac.gov, and my Twitter handle is @redblue2024. But if you want to get more information about the EAC overall, these are our email addresses, Twitter account, our website. We have a Facebook account, a YouTube channel where we put a number of videos on, and an Instagram account, which I honestly say I have not gone on because I am not in my teens anymore. So well, with that, I will stop sharing my screen and be here for any and all questions as time will allow.
Well, Chairman Hicks, thank you so much for that presentation. It clarifies a lot, at least for me, it clarified a lot of the differences between what the FEC and what the EAC does. Having Ann on the board of experts of the organization, we do know a little bit more about the FEC than we do about the EAC. And also the FEC is also more on the news for some reason. But that's neither here nor there. But I wanted
That's fine by me.
take some of the heat off the EAC. But what I don't see any questions yet in the Q&A section. I don't see any hands up in the air yet. But I did have some questions. I have two questions actually. One is, I believe one is easier than the other. I don't know which one do you want first, the easy one or the hard one?
The hard one.
All right. Well, I wanted to ask, because I did see a lot of, in your presentation, when you mentioned new EAC resources that you make available to help to election officials across the United States. You mentioned something about reporting threats accurately, perhaps. Is that something that the EAC has been putting together for the election officials lately? I know there's a study that was published last year, but the Brennan Center for Justice about election officials kind of leaving their jobs because of recent threats to their physical integrity after what happened in 2020. And I was wondering, since you is this new set of EAC resources that have to do specifically with this, does that respond in some way to that? And have you found the same thing that the Brennan Center for Justice says they found in their study, that the election officials are worried about their well-being, their physical well-being?
I think that's a great question, and not exactly too hard to answer, because we have heard from election officials about their physical safety. There's a number of federal officials who I've spoken to who say that they won't be around for the 2024 election. Why are they going to continually do this for such low pay and no recognition, and basically the harassment? You do have folks who are going to continue to do this. One of the things that we are doing in terms of trying to make sure that we have more election officials in this, and actually it's more focused on poll workers, is our Help America Vote Day, which will be August 16th of August 16th. Where we're going to be looking to recruit poll workers to serve in the general election for November 8th. We've also done a number of videos, and I put one out last week where I sat down with law enforcement officers who are also former election officials, or vice versa, where they were law enforcement officers and then became election officials, to talk about the process and some of the things that they've seen since 2020, and some of the things that people can do to safeguard themselves and what they should be doing. We live in a very hostile environment right now, and no one should feel threatened for doing their job. These folks are basically doing the same sort of, there are I say this all the time, there are aunts, there are uncles, there are grandparents, there are the teachers down the street serving as poll workers. These are not some bureaucratic government bots that are coming in just doing things. These are our fellow citizens that are being threatened for just volunteering to do their job. And for anyone who has a hesitation of thinking that the integrity of the election is not sound or is as strong as it should volunteer to be a poll worker. See it from the inside, see it as a person helping to make the process better, and not as an outsider just complaining about things going on. As for the Brennan Center report, we don't have the resources to do a report like that ourselves, but in talking to them, I think there's nothing that I can say that would make me doubt that that report is as accurate as it could be. Now for the easier question.
Well, the easier question had to do with the Clearinghouse Division, because I want to know exactly what Clearinghouse means in the election context, right? So what exactly is the Clearinghouse Division? What do they? Can you speak a little bit more about that? What the Clearinghouse, because I believe is some kind of if there is any way to outsource one of the processes involved in the election. Perhaps it has something to do with that, with outsourcing some of the services, and exactly what like the best practices to do that is that what the EAC does?
Yeah, so our Clearinghouse Division basically is there to make election officials' jobs easier. So we have, in the last 2 years, hired 8 individuals who are subject matter experts, whether or not the person who's totally devoted towards accessibility. We have folks who are former election officials themselves, so they know the process from inside and out. And so what the Clearinghouse Division does is gather information, compile that, and make it into some sort of best practice that we can get out to the states. One of the falsehoods is that each individual jurisdiction has millions of dollars to do a lot of individual things. For the most part, these jurisdictions are 1, 2, or 3 people trying to run the entire election process. And so they don't have the resources that they need to travel to, excuse me, travel to national conferences or get the information from places like the Brennan Center. But what we are able to do is compile that and get that to them directly. And one of the ways we do that is for the commissioners to go out to the states and talk to state conferences for election officials so that they know what we're doing and what resources we can provide to them. So we've always had a Clearinghouse Division, but it's mostly been 1 or 2 individuals and not able to get information out as quickly or as readily as possible. So now that we've had more people in there, we're able to update information that was, that we haven't updated in a number of years, and also to provide new information based on the changing demographics of the electoral constituency.
I see. Well, that pretty much clears up what I was wondering about what that meant. It's been a very interesting conversation. It's been a very interesting presentation, and I do thank you for your time very much. I know you have a hard stop at 5:30 EST, so I won't take too much more of your time.
Well, that was before I had to fly out to. I was going to be down in North Carolina, but that trip got canceled. So I am actually at my home. so if there's a couple more questions, I'm happy to answer those. But
I was excuse me. I was just gonna because when you mentioned something about the standards of the election, what the VVSG is that correct?
Voluntary voting system guidelines. Yes.
Right. It made me, well, first, it made me remember that, the OAS has some kind of actually proposed and promoted this, and it got approved actually in the International Standards Organization. There is an ISO rule for election with election standards. I believe it is ISO 54001 from 2019, which is actually like an ISO set of rules, just like any private company applies to be certified with ISO 9001. There is an ISO 54001 for election authorities or election organizations, and it does feel like that's a step in the right direction. Getting a set of standards together so that at least some of the things, especially in the United States, where the as you said, the organization of elections is so decentralized that at least some minimum standards are met. I guess that's not a question. That was really a comment that I had. But since we do have a few more minutes, I did want to ask about. Sorry, I had another question jotted down right here. Yes, you mentioned that you were going to recruit poll workers, that you were going to go. Is that something that the EAC usually does, or is this the first time that it's going to do it? Is this because usually I guess it's the local officials who recruit the poll workers for each local election. So is this the first time that the EAC is doing this? And is that in response to what has happened lately, or?
No, it's not the first time that we've done this. It's more of a continuation. So in 2020, with the pandemic going on and so many individuals not being able to serve as election officials or election workers or poll workers because of underlying problems or issues with COVID-19, because we've seen that so many people who serve as poll workers are usually a little bit older, retirees, and those folks were a lot more susceptible to the symptoms and ailments resulting from COVID-19. So we worked with a number of organizations, individuals, and groups to start a Help America Vote Day, and basically recruited millions or thousands of poll workers. In some places, it was so successful that they had to actually turn some poll workers away. That wasn't the case in every jurisdiction, but for a couple, that was the case. And I would think that this is another way to serve your community, to serving as a poll worker. And so our next recruitment phase will be, we did one back in January. I think it was January 22nd, but we're going to do another one on August 16th. And if folks sign up, hopefully they will not sign up for one time, but continually come back, because another piece of that is the younger people are who serve as poll workers, the more likely they are to participate in the process and continually participate in the process. So this might not be just a one-time deal for them as well.
Perfect, thank you. I think Anne had a question.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Tom, because I meet with a group online, of course, of election officials in California, even though I'm not one. And one of the things they talk about a lot is that there's inadequate funding of election infrastructure, and they have a lot of concerns about that. And I know there was a bill in pending, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that subject.
There are a few bills that are out there that deal with the funding of elections. Unfortunately, they've become a lot more partisan, and therefore it looks like they won't necessarily make it through the Congress and be signed by the president. I will say that in the latest House version of the appropriations bill, we got $400 million for funding to the states. And it looks like the Senate is also putting in $400 million. It sounds like a lot of money, but when you divide that out by the 50 states, the 5 territories in DC, it doesn't really add up to be a substantial amount, particularly for California, which has enough, 53, members of Congress, and, each of them have their own jurisdictions. And then overall with the Secretary of State's office, and, with LA County being the largest jurisdiction in the country for voting, which is larger than, I think they say, 20 states or something to that degree, or more. We need to, my hope is that someday we have a dedicated funding stream for elections, similar to the highway fund, where every year for a highway, you might not need to repave it, but you might need to deal with potholes that are on that. So every year for elections, you might not need to replace the voting equipment, but you might need to buy more ballots and things like that. So I hope that Congress seriously considers a dedicated funding stream for elections, because what works in Maine and New Hampshire is not going to necessarily work in Washington State or California. And therefore, they shouldn't prescript what the money should be spent for, but actually provide that money to the states and let the states determine what's best for their state.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Chairman Hicks, and I really, really appreciate your time. We really appreciate you taking the time to explain what the EAC does in such detail, and to talk about all of this. It seems like 1,000 problems at a time come rushing, especially during election year. But also, you know, I do believe too it's important that and not only resources are dedicated to elections, you know, not only an election year, but all the time. I think it's a sane investment, I believe, that a country can make in their democracy. But also, I think that you know, it's not. It shouldn't also be. It shouldn't when in election during election years is it's mostly when people talk about elections and suddenly remember that there's these agencies that come to life, you know, and they're actually there all year round. So it's it's a conversation that we should have every year, not just on election year. And so that's one of the reasons why we invited you, and so we so appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. And again, if there's any other questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Eduardo, for setting this